We're recording now, so go ahead, Aera.
Okay, let me know if you can see what I am looking at.
Looks good.
Awesome. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Aera England, and like Trevor said, I did a directed reading with him this semester. It's titled From Science to Society, the Opioid Crisis. And again, my supervisor is Dr. Trevor Day, and my committee members are Dr. Sarah Hewitt. So what we're going to be looking at today are what opioids are, how they interact with opioid receptors, as well as the brain regions that express opioid receptors, the opioid crisis as we know it, and what we can look forward to. So starting with opioids and their receptors. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, this is a neuron, and this is the presynaptic neuron, and this is the postsynaptic neuron. This space in the middle is called the synapse. So under normal circumstances, you can see here there are opioid receptors on this neuron, both of these neurons, but they're not activated in this side. So when an action potential reaches the end of the axon terminal, voltage-gated calcium channels open, which causes an influx of calcium. This causes the stimulation of neurotransmitter release into the synapse, which stimulates the postsynaptic neuron and propagates the signal. When opioid receptors are activated, and they can activate on the top and the bottom here, on the top, it actually prevents the influx of calcium from entering the presynaptic neuron, and that prevents the release of neurotransmitters. So, and then on the bottom, we also have hyperpolarization occurring, which is when the postsynaptic membrane, it requires more stimulation in order to create an action potential on that side of the synapse. So just to orient you to a little bit of neuroscience here, this is a sensory neuron sending in signals from the periphery towards the spinal cord. This is the spinal neuron. We have both exogenous and endogenous opioids. So exogenous opioids are ones like morphine, fentanyl, the ones that you would have heard of pharmaceuticals, whereas endogenous opioids are created by the brain itself. And ones you may have heard of are endorphins, or in this example is enkephalin, because enkephalins work at the spinal neurons. And so when these opioid receptors along various parts of the neurons are activated, they have different effects. So to start, we have the presynaptic dendrite. When that opioid receptor is activated, it causes reduced sensitization, which means that it requires more stimulus in order to send an action potential down the axon of the neuron. There's also an opioid receptor on the cell body of the neuron itself, and when that opioid receptor is activated, it causes modification of gene expression. And again, from the former image, when we have the presynaptic axon, the opioid receptor upon it being activated, we have reduced neurotransmitter release. And then again, on the postsynaptic neuron, we have reduced excitability, and all of these come together and end up reducing the sensation of pain. So there are three different standard opioid receptors that are studied in pharmacology. The ones that we're going to be focused on mostly today are mu-opioid receptors. So when activated, they cause euphoria, stress coping effects, analgesic, which is pain relief, and morphine and other morphine derivatives act on these mu-opioid receptors. So what part of the brains express opioid receptors? So there's many different parts of the brain and body that possess opioid receptors, but I just want to focus on 6 and mostly just one. So just looking at how opioids work in the brain overall, we have these 3 regions: the anterior cingulate cortex, which is in the frontal lobe, the insula, which is a lobe of its own, and the amygdala, which is part of your limbic system, which is involved in modulating your emotions. And all of these are involved in the perception and appraisal of pain. We also have the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area, and these regions are implicated in reward and motivation. But most importantly, there are many mu-opioid receptors that are expressed in the brainstem, and the brainstem is responsible for controlling breathing. So there are 3 different mechanisms that contribute to normal breathing. We're just going to be focusing on the yellow and the red for now. So the yellow is modulatory mechanisms, and this is controlled by a region of the pons, 2 nuclei called the follicular fuse complex, and they are involved in patterning and stability. So when the opioid receptors on these neurons are activated, we have issues with abnormal patterning and stability. Also, the red here is rhythmogenic mechanism. So down here, two little red nuclei, these are called the pre-Boxinger complex. And these neurons are rhythmogenic, which means that they are the neurons that send a signal to your diaphragm to cause you to breathe. And so when these neurons, the opioid receptors upon them are activated, we have a loss of rhythm. And overall, this contributes to the single most deadly side effect of opioid poisoning, which is opioid-induced respiratory depression. Speaking of deadly side effects of opioids, let's go ahead and talk about the opioid crisis. So I'm sure that we've all heard of the opioid crisis pre-COVID-19. It was all over the news. COVID has kind of taken a little bit of the front stage, but let's not forget this is a pandemic that is also occurring at the same time. So in 2016, it was estimated that nearly 27 million people worldwide had opioid use disorder, and that is a nearly 50% increase from 1990. What's interesting to note here is that the highest prevalences is in high-income North America, followed by North Africa and the Middle East. So this is a drug that really does not discriminate between socioeconomic class, level of education, gender, race, anything really. We're all susceptible to opioid use disorder. So it's commonly accepted that there are three waves of the opioid crisis, beginning in the late 1990s. I imagine that we will be looking at a fourth wave when the data is available. So beginning with the first wave in the late 1990s, we see a rise in prescription opioid deaths. So just the orange sheet of the graph, we have years on the bottom, deaths per 100,000 people. This is in the United States. The red line is deaths caused by synthetic opioids. Blue is deaths caused by heroin, and orange is commonly prescribed opioids. So between 1999 and 2010, we're seeing a steep, well, not steep increase, but a steady increase in the rise of deaths caused by commonly prescribed opioids. But as we're moving into 2010 here, we're starting to see a bit of a plateau and then a slight increase in the rise of heroin-related deaths. So the literature is a little, has some disagreement, but because they decide, or they say that 2013 is when the international importation of drugs such as fentanyl, fentanyl analogues, and other novel synthetic opioids that are incredibly potent started to infiltrate the North American drug supply. But my research shows that it actually started more in the early 2000s. And so some of these heroin-related deaths may actually be misattributed and may be fentanyl or fentanyl analog related. We just didn't have the technology to test for it back then. Now that we do have the technology to test for it, you can see here that the orange and the blue lines are starting to taper off while this red line is shooting way up. And we are seeing like a 5-fold increase in 4 years of synthetic related opioid deaths. And from 2017 on, you can see the trajectory, it's just not looking good. We need to do something about it. What are these synthetic opioids? Well, I'm sure that we've all heard of heroin before. It is a semi-synthetic derivative of morphine, diacetyl morphine. It's about 10 times more potent than morphine. Whereas fentanyl is used very safely in medical settings. It is a very potent analgesic. It's about 10 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. One you may not have heard of before is carfentanil. And carfentanil is actually used in veterinary settings. It is used to tranquilize elephants, so it's not appropriate for human use under any circumstance. It is 10,000 times stronger than morphine, 4,000 times stronger than heroin, and 20 to 30 times stronger than fentanyl. And the really dangerous part about contamination of samples with carfentanil is that it doesn't respond well to naloxone. So if you don't know what naloxone is, it's a mu opioid antagonist. So the drugs that I've been talking about are agonists. So they bind to the receptor and they produce their effects. Well, the antagonist is actually going to pull off the previously bound molecule. So I'll show you what that looks like here. So when a person uses opioids and they are experiencing an opioid poisoning, this yellow squares represent the opioid saturating the receptor. When that person is administered naloxone, either intramuscularly or intranasally, it actually pulls all of the receptors, the opioid off the receptor and replaces it with naloxone, which can prevent death. So talking about adulterants, this is a very complicated graph, but it's local. It's from Victoria. It was last year, so this is 2021. We're looking at a 12-month period. On the side here, we have percent of the total number of samples they tested, which they use the term opioid down, because as you can see, they really don't know what it is. So, and then on the bottom, it's the number of specific samples that contained these specific ingredients. So the important thing to notice is that the blue is expected only, and the tan is an additional active ingredient. And so by the end of this year, we're seeing that only 30% of the drugs that people are believing that they're buying are the expected drug, and upwards of 70% contain an additional active ingredient, whether that's carfentanil or some other drugs, and then also benzos. So benzodiazepines, you may have heard of them before, such as Valium, Xanax, clonazepam. When they're talking about benzo-related here, they're actually talking about xylazine, which is a horse benzodiazepine, and it's incredibly dangerous, but it also works really well at enhancing the effects of opioids, which is why drug dealers put it into the drugs that they sell. So that was some pretty dark stuff. Let's see what we can do looking forward. There is actually hope. So we did look at this pyramid before. I didn't talk much about anything other than the MORs, because looking down here, dysphoria, stress, negative effect, not really something you want. So when these receptors are activated, that is the response that they produce. Luckily, there's been some research that has been done into X-ray crystallography, where they have figured out the structure of the kappa opioid receptor, and they have created a mixed mu kappa opioid agonist. So it's a new type of drug that would provide analgesic effects without causing the negative effects such as respiratory depression. And it does so because it does not activate the arrestin pathway. The beta arrestin pathway is implicated in many of the negative side effects of opioid use, including opioid-induced respiratory depression, as well as withdrawal and cravings. There's lots of complicated cascades involved, and it is activated at the same time as the mu opioid receptor. And so by having a drug that does not cause this, then we can have analgesic effects without the danger. Also, this research came out, and I got the email on October 26th. So this was like halfway through my research. I couldn't believe my luck, but there is actually a vaccine that they have created. And yes, it's only been demonstrated in rats, but the idea is it's just like any other vaccine. You would take it and it would prevent, it would neutralize the fentanyl that would be in your system for a month. So this is really important for people who have just come through acute withdrawal, which means that they have no tolerance to opioids and they may not have the appropriate coping mechanisms to be able to abstain from using opioids. So in this case, that person would be vaccinated, and if they were using fentanyl, then the antibody would neutralize the fentanyl molecule and prevent it from entering the brain, which is where it exerts its effects. So that being said, these are some amazing technologies, but we are a number of years off from seeing them in practice. Let's talk about education. So some of you may not know what DARE is. DARE is the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. It was created and implemented in public schools in North America in 1983. And so that's nearly 40 years, which means that we have nearly 40 years of statistically significant evidence that it does nothing, if not harms the people's understanding of drugs. So what I'm proposing is that we talk to each other, we talk to our kids, we talk to our friends, and we discuss what drugs actually are and what the actual risks of using drugs are, because you cannot stop people from doing drugs. They are going to do drugs from now until the end of time. But there is a way to do it safely, and that is through harm reduction, such as naloxone kits, clean needle exchanges, safe consumption sites, but also just conversations. It's not a dirty word. People who use drugs are not bad people. They're just people. And what we can do to reduce the stigma is to talk about it. So with that, I'd just like to thank Dr. Trevor Day, who is my supervisor and my mentor, and Dr. Sarah Hewitt, my committee member, as well as all of those who are struggling with addiction or love someone who is struggling with addiction. Thank you so much.
1445, Aera, you nailed it.
I
I know,
practiced so many
I
times.
know how hard you worked to nail that, so I just wanted to acknowledge it. Thanks so much for a really diverse and expansive talk about an important topic. I'm pretty sure I know that Sarah and Kurt have questions. So I'd like to keep it to start with the academic side, and then I know you have a lot of guests here, and I really want to provide an opportunity for them to ask questions if they want as well. So let's start with the academic side first, and then we can move to a broader audience. So any questions for Aera around the talk? So before Mike, Sarah's in the chat. She's been paying attention off to the side, and she got suckered into invigilating an exam right now because no one else could. And so she's put her question in the chat. So I'll just read it for you.
Hey, Trevor, can I just pop in quick? I just have to run to actually another
Sure.
meeting. So thanks, Aera, for the presentation. Great job. And I'll just drop my question in the chat as well.
Okay. Thanks so much, Mike, for coming. Great to see you.
Yeah. See everyone later.
Okay, bye. Thanks. All right. We'll wait for Mike's question to pop up as well, but I'll start with Sarah. So Sarah says, first of all, great talk, Aera. Important and interesting information. You mentioned a few brain regions. Sorry, just got bumped here. But you mentioned a few brain regions, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the reward pathways in addiction. Sarah mentioned to me that she saw that you talked about it in your manuscript, because I sent her a draft, by the way, and but also wants to know a little bit about that. So can you address a little bit about the reward pathways? Because you didn't touch it in your talk, but I know you know something about it.
Yeah, I mean, my paper is close to 30 pages long, so 15 minutes can't really do it justice. But so yeah, so the thing about I'm sure you guys maybe have heard of like dopamine pathways and dopaminergic neurons, and that is heavily involved with opioid use because it works on the dopaminergic system. And so your dopaminergic neurons are located in your substantia nigra, and then they send afferents out to all different parts of your brain, and they are the dopamine producing neurons. And so the way that opioids work on these neurons is that they cause issues with GABA, which is, I don't need to say the word, it's basically a neurotransmitter that calms you down, and also glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter that is excitatory. And so basically it's going to be modulating these receptors. And if anyone knows anything about the GABA receptor, it has 6 different parts of it that can all be affected in a bunch of different ways. So it's very complicated to explain, but basically these dopaminergic afferents are going out and they're being modulated by interneurons. And so if, let's say, the GABA pathway is being inhibited, then you're still getting so much excitatory input from those dopaminergic neurons, which is making you like it. That's what you like. Your brain likes dopamine, basically all you like. And so that's how those pathways end up becoming a little wired, I guess is the word I would use. Does that answer your question? Trevor, does that answer her question?
No, that's great. That was a nice, concise explanation too. That was really accessible to broad audiences. So thanks so much. Sarah also says thanks. Awesome. I'll leave Mike's question for you and I to chat about, just because he's not here to hear the answer. Because I'd rather focus on people that are here now. And Kurt, he's got his hand up. So Kurt, go ahead.
Thanks, Trevor. Aera, thanks. As a really good talk. Trevor and I think everyone can usually find an impact or somebody that's been impacted by this. One question that I had, and I don't know, it was the population distribution. So and I'm wondering if there's a diversity in the breakdown. I don't whether or not it was high income countries versus I assume that it was then low income from Africa versus Middle East. Is the reasoning for the overdose in these or the use in these populations different? So, and I'm trying to understand who in those populations is using, and is it a different makeup? Because and then will that change the risk associated with its use, or is it's non-discriminating anyways?
So let's just also keep in mind, like when I show you those graphs and I say 27 million people, that includes people who are prescribed medication or are taking medication out of their parents' cabinets or are buying drugs on the street or are buying drugs online. So there is a lot of different ways that people become somebody who uses opioids. And so really like that data was, that particular quote was from a paper that was about handling opioid use disorder as a family physician. So it was just more from that, my knowledge of that paper is that it's non-discriminatory, but it is interesting that high income North America, because, you know, we've all seen movies, we all know like the fancy drugs, like you think of like cocaine being a very expensive drug. Well, opioids are not that expensive. So why are high income people choosing to use them over the, you know, glamorous drugs, let's say? Yeah, so it's tough because this is a biology paper, but it's so integrated into the sociology of just like the world today.
Absolutely. When I was in Australia, my daughter broke her arm, and she was getting surgery, and they were asking questions, and she was really nervous, and they came in and asked if she could be part of a study, and I was like, well, what is it? Of course, they didn't know that I was in the room really interested in respiratory physiology and anesthesiology information. And they said, well, we're using fentanyl as the anesthesia in this, but we actually just treat the dose as if we're using a small human for kids, but we don't really have a good insight into the pulmonary ventilation of children versus adults, and it was all going to be respiratory or delivered through respiratory measures. So of course I was like, yeah, let's be part of this, and I just still think that, I mean, there's still so little that we know, and I really think that vaccine, that sounds really promising, because I know that medical use can sometimes re-trigger an addiction sometimes in individuals, and having a protection against that would be really nice to see. Thank you. Thank you, Aera. That's a great talk.
So Sarah had a question, and I would love to answer this question. So she said, "Does not."
Aera, just stand by. Paul had to leave, so I'll get to Sarah's other question, Aera. So I want you to get to it too. But I just want to acknowledge what Paul's comment was here. As Kurt said, this touches a lot of people, and I think it's important to recognize, as Aera always says, that it's often can target any socioeconomic group. And Kurt and I lost a very close friend 5 years ago on the 21st to this. And Paul is suggesting there's a memorial on December 21st, the longest night of the year, regarding people who we've lost to opioids. So I think it's really telling, just given that it's actually an anniversary for us as well. So Paul just wanted to say thanks so much for the presentation and calling it a pandemic, because that's what it is. And just to think about all the people we've lost. So thanks, Paul, for coming if you haven't left yet. And I just wanted to acknowledge Paul's comment for making the effort to come by today. Sorry to cut you off, Aera.
No.
But Sarah asked a question about naloxone, whether it helps stay off opioids or just an acute intervention to an acute opioid poisoning. So Aera, go ahead.
This is one of my favorite topics, so I'm very happy to talk about this. And naloxone actually is very short acting. So people who have undergone a poisoning often need repeated administrations of naloxone, because it's a very high potency. Like, let's say they're not used to using fentanyl, and they've been completely saturated, then it's just to pull that off. But if there's still fentanyl in their system, it can go back on, so it can reverse, which is why people who undergo poisoning are often recommended to be watched for 24 to 36 hours under medical supervision. But naloxone is part of a tablet that is taken sublingually that is called Suboxone. And so there's a drug called buprenorphine, which is a partial mu-opioid agonist. So what it does is it binds to the mu receptors, but only partially. So it doesn't cause that intracellular cascade that opioids cause. So it's just like a little band-aid that says, it's okay, we're here, but we're not actually going to cause any problems. But people use buprenorphine and can use it recreationally. So they put Suboxone, or Suboxone is buprenorphine, Subutex, and naloxone together. And that is because naloxone is not bioavailable through the mouth. And so when they're taking their buprenorphine or their Suboxone, they spit it out when they're done. And then for 36 hours, they're not going to go into withdrawal or experience cravings. Well, the naloxone prevents people from crushing it up and injecting it. So naloxone is bioavailable through the nose, in the blood, in the muscle, but is not readily available through the GI tract. And I'm sure you've also heard of methadone, but methadone is an opioid, like it's a full synthetic mu-opioid agonist, and is just as dangerous as using opioids, especially for people who are at risk of taking multiple opioids with methadone. So that's why the vaccine is a good idea. But honestly, it's got to be therapy. Like these things are just to help you get off of the opioids. It's all going to come from you and from your willingness and your fight every day to stay sober. Buprenorphine can also be used to help with acute withdrawal syndrome. So when people are in opioid withdrawal, like let's say 24, 36, 48 hours in, they can be given buprenorphine and it actually can quell those withdrawal symptoms, which can really help with people who are at high risk for relapse. Okay, I'm obviously very passionate about that part.
You were prepared for that. So is there anyone that's not from Mount Royal that came to watch Jared's talk before we kind of open it up to other students? Like Lucy's got one in the chat here. So we've acknowledged Paul's comment, but is there anyone else that came to watch Aera that's not from Mount Royal that would like to make a comment or ask a question? This is turning into like a master's defense era.
No, I love it. So Sarah said just before Lucy, sorry, just with the most important direction for researchers right now, is it understanding intracellular pathways better, developing better treatments? I think it's going to have to be, and I'm not a social worker, but the social work kind of paradigm is that you meet people where they are. And so with opioid use disorder, it's a mental condition, right? But it's also precipitated by a physiological problem that's being precipitated by the drug use, right? So I think it's going to be understanding, like I said, like the vaccine provides longer safety, is just trying to figure out how we can protect people until we can support them into their own sobriety. I think we've got a lot figured out about the neuroscience. I could write an entire textbook on it after doing this literature review, but the social element's tough.
Thanks so much, Aera. Vidya is saying she works on harm reduction with the Sharp Foundation and wants more information on naloxone resistance. So thanks. Thanks for addressing Sarah's questions, Aera. Looks like Kurt's got to run. Thanks so much, Kurt, for staying for all three. Great to see you. Looking forward to seeing you at the Hypoxia Symposium in February. So we'll catch up then. Man, there's a lot of catch up here. Lucy, I think you had a question.
Yeah, hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm like in a stairwell. It's kind of sketchy. Anyways, great talk, Aera. It was fantastic. I had a quick question just regarding more of that neuroscience portion. So I'm really curious to see whether the drug actually reduced certain like gray matter in the brain. I was wondering if you kind of came across any of that in your literature, or if you're seeing, reduction of amygdala size or anything in that kind of area.
So yes, and I did not really focus on that in my research either in the literature review or the presentation, but one thing I can remember is there is reduction in the gray matter of the periaqueductal ductal area. So that's like right in the middle of your brain, right? So I don't know what that means because I didn't research it. I researched the other 6 brain regions. But so yeah, there is actually morphological changes, as well as like what we don't know as what is the long-term effects of using such potent opioids. Like we can see brain damage in scans from people who are long-term drug users of other drugs, even less potent opioids. And we can see that there are actual changes that are happening, and whether or not that's from hypoxic brain injury, from opioid-induced respiratory depression, or that is actual like changes that are like we're seeing like morphologic changes. That is something that I am not familiar with, but I know one region has changed. But thank you for your question.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much. Fantastic talk again.
Thanks for making it.
Lucy, from your excellent presentation yesterday about how rubbish training programs are around sex education, and Aera's comments today about how rubbish some of these educational programs are in schools, it makes me really sad for the state of education of kids. And I think the two of you should get together and, as you said yesterday, burn it all down and start over again. Great stuff. So we've gone a little bit over, but I'm really, really pleased with the engagement we've had with all 3 speakers today. So I'll just say thanks to Spencer, Terry, and Aera for incredible efforts this semester. These things are always imperfect in terms of their organization, but it really comes down to the level of commitment and work ethic of the 3 of you. And I'm just so impressed by how far these projects have come and the polish to which you put on these talks. And and your willingness to engage with it. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who came to support these students in this sort of like ad hoc session. But with that, this really marks the sort of end of the semester, and so looking forward to seeing some final manuscripts. But otherwise, happy holidays to everyone, and we'll be in touch if need be. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Trevor, I had a real quick question I was hoping to ask you.
Sure.
It was just related to how I dropped